David, in the second part of this interview, I want to explore some possible criticisms of your project. And the first question I have is this: aren't you reading your sources, especially the Latin sources, far too literally? I mean, isn't it a bit like, you know, in 200 years from now, people read newspapers such as the Daily Mail or the Sun, or in Germany the Bild-Zeitung, and I think, oh my God, this must have been, you know, an absolutely horrible society with all these foreigners and all these problems going on. Or if you look at contemporary philosophers, people like Agamben or Zizek. Zizek wrote, as you know, wrote a book called Living in the End Times. So the people you are reading, because there are no real statistical data about ancient Rome, so the people you're reading, they're writers, they are creative writers. Aren't you taking them too literally?
Yeah, well, I could say two things to that. On the one hand, of course, the book, as what we are talking about, is not only about reality, but also about its perception, about culture. Culture is in our minds, it's not in reality. And so the fact that that the present is seen as very critical, as very dangerous, as something declining, for example, even if it is not true, it suffices that people think it. So, I mean, and that is also why I would see no contradiction in the fact that, for example, even the Bild-Zeitung is something very representative of what many people think. And in antiquity, of course, it was also the same case. I mean, we have, of course, only these authors, and also only in a very fragmentary way. We have no statistics, as you said, but the number of authors and their position also in the state is clearly very indicative of a feeling of crisis, of decline. So I would say that it can be compared very well, as it reflects what people are thinking. And then the second step, of course, is if people are really thinking that, then they are acting also in accordance with what they are feeling, regardless if it is true or not. And so they are shaping a world which is becoming exactly as they want it to be, or as they fear it to be. So even so, the perception becomes also reality, and I think that makes it very very feasible, and I think absolutely coherent to have this approach of comparing the perception of elements of decline. And regardless of this, there are many elements in the late Roman Republic which even beyond the pure analysis of the contemporaries were true. There was a true decline in the usual traditional religion, because many temples crumbled, it was difficult to find new priests and so on. So that was a reality. There were the civil wars, there were many problems of violence in Roman town. There was this problem of declining demography everyone is speaking about. There is Romanization. So regardless of what people are thinking also, that was a reality, as many of these elements are realities too. So I would say on the both hand, the perception and the reality, I think that many of the claims, or I hope so, all the claims I did in that book have some solid fundament in either the one or the other form of reality.
And to what extent would you say that they are actually typical exclusively of the Roman Republic and the European Union? Because some of the things you mention, you talk about the rampant materialism, the isolation, the isolated lives that people are living in the big cities, their careerism and so on, not caring about their families. Surely if you look at literature across the ages, those are sort of topoi, ideas that keep coming back, and that a certain type of culturally pessimist authors put forward, but that are by no means specific to the Roman Republic or the European Union.
Of course, there are many elements in crisis which has a long history in time, and where you can find in nearly every generation the lament that it was better before, that the younger are not behaving well anymore towards the elder, for example. So things like that are, of course, pretty much universal.
So what gives you the idea that things are different now?
Because on the one hand, I would remind you about Machiavelli, who also said that the lament about the fact that the past was better than the present is universal, but that it is true at some moments and not at others. So the presence of the topos does not necessarily mean that it is always wrong, this topos. And the fact that in the late Roman Republic, as today, we see the concordance of a huge number of factors, which are not only psychological factors, as the lament that people are more individualistic, are more materialistic, feel more lonely today, but there are many hard facts, such as, for example, the problems linked to, for example, to the global, the growing social polarization, to the problem of demography we spoke about, the problem of immigration, of wars. All these problems are not only topoi, they are there in reality. They are linked, of course, to many of these more psychological elements, but in their collusion, in their addition, they are, I think, quite unique in the late Roman Republic and also today.
Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering whether you're painting a rather bleak picture of the European Union, and I'm just wondering, the American historian Stephen Kotkin says something that I find very, very appealing and very, very, very convincing. He says, in a sense, pessimism is easy, because if you're a pessimist and you're right, everyone says you're a genius. If you're a pessimist and you're wrong, people are also grateful to you because you said, oh, this was a really important warning that we needed. Mm-hmm. So this idea that pessimism is easy. And then he says, actually it's the success that's much more difficult, because the success then generates all kinds of expectations. Mm-hmm. And then if reality falls even a little bit short of those expectations, then people suddenly become very unhappy. So my question is, isn't it the case with Europe? The European Union really has its roots in the immediate post-war situation, where people said, we don't want to have all the wars, the First World War, the Second World War ever again. Plus, we need to cooperate economically, so you get the European Community for coal and steel and so on. But that was all done on a basis where, say, France and Germany had just gone to war with each other, and these people had killed each other. Mm-hmm. Now, just look at the situation between France and Germany. It's much, much better. And then there are even small tensions, and then people immediately say, oh my God, there are big problems now. Actually, aren't we doing fine compared to, say, the immediate post-war situation, let alone the actual World War itself? Haven't things improved enormously, materially, culturally, in terms also of the way they perceive each other? I mean, Brexit is seen as almost like the end of civilization as we know it, but it's happening without a war, without people killing each other. Hasn't there actually been enormous progress?
Yeah, two elements in this. I would first say that optimism is also very easy, exactly as pessimism. As you could say, well, if you're an optimist, then if you're right, then you are also considered as a genius, and if you are false, people will say, yes, but it was more prudent to be optimist, because that would at least spark the hope and the wish to be better. So in that way, pessimism or optimism finally are as argumentation strategies, I would say, on the main level, or the same level. So pessimism, I think, is not easier than optimism, but they are only different outlooks. On the European Union, I would not necessarily now consider the European Union as the root of the many crisis factors and problems I described. They are rather a symptom also of an underlying dynamics that happened in the late Roman Republic, that happens also today. Of course, there are many positive elements linked to the European unification, and all these analogies tend to show that a form of European state will have a very important future, and that the European Union is not at all coming to its end, but is transforming into something, in my view, probably much more stable and much more long-lasting. So it's not necessarily a negative element. Indeed, the European Union led to many positive elements, though I would say that the long decades of peace we have enjoyed in some parts of Europe are not necessarily due to the European communities, but rather to the Cold War and the situation of Cold War between these two blocs. It was not the military strength of the European communities that assured the peace in front of the Soviet Union, but rather the presence of the American troops and of nuclear weapons. So it's only some years ago, finally, that the European Union can show its usefulness on a diplomatic domain, and if you look at the disaster of the Yugoslavian war, if you look at the many problems now with immigration, if you look at the downfall of the Ukrainian East, I would say that war has not been banished at all in the European world, but is everywhere on its fringes. Exactly as in the Roman Republic too, where the Roman Republic on the one hand of course brought peace to large parts of the Mediterranean, but also at the price of many asymmetrical wars on its border. But of course it's not the European Union that is responsible for declining demographies or the crisis of family or globalization. It is rather a phenomenon of the same tendency.
But it still sounds to me enormously pessimistic, almost even defeatist. And I want to ask the question in a more, I have a question on that which I want to ask in a more sort of methodological way. You were heavily influenced, or at least inspired, by the German thinker Oswald Spengler, the author of a book called Der Untergang des Abendlandes, The Decline of the West. And don't you, just like Spengler, have a kind of, there's almost a sense of sort of historical inevitability about your book, as I say, almost a kind of defeatism, or we've seen it with the Roman Republic. The same things are happening now. There's nothing we can do. It's all going down the drain. Is it like that? Is that what you're saying?
Not going down the drain. It is transforming. I think the Roman Republic transformed into the Principate exactly as for the moment the European Union is restructuring itself and is transforming into something which will be different. It won't be necessarily the same geographical extent. There will be other institutions, but it's a process of transformation of a more oligarchic, technocratical state into something more authoritarian. On the question to what degree this is defeatist, I would say it is determinist. It's not necessarily defeatist, as I think that would be for historians very short-sighted to apply categories such as decline as defeatism or onto the period he is studying. I'm fully convinced that every human being can be more or less happy under all conditions, and Ranke of course said that every period is at the same distance towards God or towards happiness or whatever. So it's not necessarily
it's less pleasurable to live under a kind of Erdogan type of dictator who's amassing more and more powers than it is to live in a country like Holland or Belgium or Britain.
It depends, of course, on the period, on the person we are speaking about. If we think about the Roman Republic, it was without any doubt much more convenient, interesting and sympathetic to live under Augustus than in the last years of the Roman Republic, when they had a republican system which was tearing itself apart. So it depends, of course, also on the person of the ruler, on the institutions. Of course, the Principate bought its wealth, its peace, its laws with the loss of political liberty and freedom to some extent, but it was still a hugely enjoyable period to live in some way. I think that it is which explains also why there have been no real attempts to go back to the Republic once the Principate was set in. So if I think about many people living now in the banlieues of Paris, for example, who have this huge problem of unemployment, of insecurity, of disorder, of émeute urbaine, of the problem of identity, of immigration, about the huge gap between the rich and the poor, about the problem also about the aging of the society, the crumbling of democratic institutions. I think that if you add to that a little portion of terrorism, of social unrest, etc., that there are many people who would really prefer to live under a more or less authoritarian European state if it can provide welfare, jobs, security, then in these conditions many people are already living in.
Yeah, but that is kind of precisely my question, because it seems to me, and this brings us back to the historical inevitability and the determinism, that you see two roads. One is kind of decline and all going down the drain, and then the way out for you seems to be some sort of, well, at least we have a kind of authoritarianism, which is not ideal, but at least then we don't have to decline. Isn't there a way where we can work towards sort of be more constructive, more positive about this? And I would even make that question a little bit sort of more polemical. When you talk about your sources, the Roman sources, and many of these writers, and I said, well, are these really descriptions? Are they not rather sort of literature or warnings or exaggerations like we might have with the Daily Mail and so on? And then you said, yes, but that's part of the cultural discourse as well. And then eventually people will start behaving like that, which is probably true. But doesn't the same apply then to your analysis as well? There's this book by a German-born American historian called The Politics of Cultural Despair. And the German title is Kulturpessimismus als politische Gefahr, cultural pessimism as a political danger. And what Stern says in the book is that what we historians say are just analyses actually might become self-fulfilling prophecies, might contribute to the decline that we claim to be describing. Aren't you in danger of doing exactly the same thing by sort of sketching only these two ways, either decline or a kind of autocratic regime? And that's it, guys. Aren't you then just contributing to the pessimism and working against a possible constructive solution?
Yeah, I'm not sure if these are really two ways. I think rather in Hegelian way that the what you call decline will lead immediately to an authoritarian state. So it's not the alternative, it will be the outcome in some way of this dialectic procedure. The authoritarian or strong regime in Europe will not be the alternative to the decline, but will be the synthesis, of course, of this dialectical moment that is happening for the moment.
You're saying it will be the outcome. Are you saying it will be the outcome, or you think it might be the outcome, and by God, I hope it won't be the outcome, and I'll work very hard to make sure it doesn't become the outcome. Or is there just nothing we can do?
Yeah, of course. I'm also the last one to hope that my predictions or my vision will come true as a father of two little sons. I really hope that my descriptions are absolutely erroneous. But I don't really see the alternative within our system. For me, the parallels are too manifest. They are too multifaceted also, because it's not only about an institutional problem or political. It's a huge social, huge cultural identity problem which goes into so many fields of our everyday life that I can really see with difficulty how we can avoid going into that direction. And the politics of the last years have already, since 2013 when the book was published, or 2011 when it was written, many things have happened since then which I feared and which exactly took place. Your question towards the responsibility of the historian, I would say that the alternative to describing what I described would be even more destructive, because the alternative would then be that I say, okay, then in that case I will censor myself, I will not publish this book because I don't want it to happen. But that is then self-imposed censorship, and that would be in some way even the confirmation that this tendency towards a rather monocratic, monolithic, ideological regime would already be true. So in some way the fact of publishing it is not necessarily, in my view, an action of actually helping it to see the day to see the light of the day, but rather an action of opposition in order to show how very probably things will become without being very enthusiastic about to the contrary.
But isn't it still possible that there are? I'm sort of an optimist. Is it still possible that you have another outcome? I mean, in French, I've got this wonderful saying, reculer pour mieux sauter. You know, take a step back in order to make a better jump, a better leap later. So if you look at Brexit, for example, which I think it's a shame that it happened. But isn't just a way to look at another way to look at that, to say, look, the European Union had become too big, too immobile. It didn't seem capable of reform. And what we now see is that some countries are becoming a little bit more nationalistic, Britain even to the extent where it is withdrawing entirely from the European Union. In other cases, countries might take their distance and are already taking their distance from the European Union. It doesn't seem very problematic to me. Same with certain laws and regulations that were introduced at a certain moment in time. If you take Schengen, the freedom of movement, then I think any time that is discussed now, people like Jean-Claude Juncker immediately say, oh, Schengen freedom of movement absolutely has to be preserved, otherwise it'll be the end of the European Union. Mm-hmm. I don't see that at all. I mean, why this was introduced at a certain moment in time, now because of terrorism and a number of other problems, things have changed. It would be perfectly, the European Union, in my view, should be able to say, okay, let's do away with Schengen for the time being, or let's change it. So a much more sort of pragmatic approach, an approach that says, okay, as far as the European Union is concerned, as much nation state as possible and as much European Union as needed. And we don't dream, we don't, for the moment anyway, continue to dream the dream of the big European Union where everyone is happy together and has a European identity. We're just a bit more cautious, a bit more pragmatic about things. And we don't give in to this idea that if we have to take one or two things back that the European Union has introduced, that's the sort of the end of the European Union or the end of the world. Isn't that cautious, pragmatic way forward? Isn't that much more realistic and actually entirely possible?
Yeah, I think that would be largely overestimating the importance of the European Union and its institutions to the many problems the Western society is facing. I mean, you can doctor as much as you wish at the current European institutions. That will have no impact at all on the real problems of our continent. The real problems are unemployment. The real problem is the falling demographics. The real problem is how to integrate suddenly large masses of immigrants into our society. The real problem is also about how to assure the care for the elderly in the next generations. The real problem is how to face the situation of a rising and more important China. So that there are many problems which are not at all in the hands of any decision either of the national state or of the European Union. So the fact of deconstructing or reinforcing the European Union, I think, will have no impact on the fact that there are so many crisis factors today, as it was in the late Roman Republic, that a big social and political crisis seems to me unavoidable, regardless the current shape of the institutions. It will gain its momentum and its own effect on the future of these institutions. Of course, you are right in the fact that the future is never entirely prescribed. And I mean, there are so many differences between the Roman Republic and today's Western world that history will not repeat itself exactly in the same way, as there's of course a huge difference in only if you think about the technological state of the modern world. So it will not be exactly the same, but I think the general tendency will tend towards a stronger, unified, more or less authoritarian, charismatic regime in Europe with a large-term possibility of imposing social and political reforms. And you are right to the fact that it is up to us to shape this future and to see if we want to go with the current and to know that it will lead into that direction and trying to shape it in the most human way possible and to ensure a maximum political participation, or if we simply want to say no, it won't happen because it can't happen, because we do not want it to happen, and then to head full front towards the clash. Because then, if we really have a clash, social unrest, even forms of civil war, then it is clear that such a new regime will not be based on political consensus, but rather on the force of weapons. And then, of course, the new regime will be much less democratic still than it might be. So there is a possibility of shaping the future, but I think its possibilities are quite reduced, I fear. I hope I'm wrong.
I've got a final question, which is sort of something that has been at the basis, the foundation of what you've been talking about. You do the comparison between the Roman Republic and the European Union, but as you've acknowledged several times, the European Union, most, perhaps even all of the phenomena that you described can be seen in the modern world in its entirety. Some of in Trump, in Turkey, and with Erdogan, and so on. Is that something you want to work on for your next book? I know you're working on your next book. What's the next book going to cover?
Yeah, I think the fact that I would say that most of these facts, they concern the Western world. So North America essentially, and Europe, Russia including. I would say that the fact that similar phenomena are happening also in Turkey, for example, and also in the South America, I know much less, unfortunately, is because these countries have become to a certain extent also Europeanized, even though, of course, the Turkish situation can only be understood by the internal dynamics of Islam and of Turkish nationalism, much more than through the lens of Western history. Yeah, I'm very much interested into including also other societies, other culture, civilizations into that scope. And I have to confess, as you said, that in fact this book is in some way an accident, because I wanted it rather as a sequel to a rather philosophical work about world history. I'm writing for years now, in fact, and as life goes, this one has been published much earlier finally than the general system it fits in, which will also ideally incorporate Chinese, Indian, Muslim, Sumerian, Egyptian, and so on history. So that is the larger project of, yeah, in some way not rewriting, but taking again or adopting again the outlook you could find with, for example, with in Giambattista Vico, in Hegel, in Spengler, in Toynbee, and trying to adapt it to the modern world, to the modern current state of knowledge. So that will be the project for the future.
So a grand sweep of world history, of which this is a part, as it were, and you're now building it, making it bigger, going back further in time.
Exactly.
David Engels, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you much for the invitation and the discussion.